Mr. President.
The Democratic whip.
Mr. President, it's been my great honor to represent the state of Illinois in this chamber for many years. And I've been present for a lot of proceedings which are memorable, some historic. I can't think of one in its simplicity that is as important as what we witnessed in the last hour in debate. We are literally asking a fundamental question about our democracy that is seldom asked. It's rare that we have a circumstance where we have to ask it, but we certainly understand in this situation that it must be resolved. What I tried to do in establishing this resolution was to make it as pointed, as direct, and as simple as possible. There are whereas clauses which are little or no consequence, but the resolution clause is so simple and direct that I want to repeat it before I make my request for unanimous consent. Resolved that the Senate affirms that, number one, Article 3 of the Constitution of the United States vests the judicial power of the United States in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Number two, as Chief Justice Marshall held in Supreme Court's landmark 1803 decision, Marbury versus Madison, it is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. And number three, the Constitution of the United States and established precedent require the executive branch to comply with all federal court rulings. That's it. It acknowledges Article 3, establishing the courts. It acknowledges Marbury versus Madison, one of the very first cases any student of law in the United States must understand. And number three, it says clearly the Constitution and established precedent require the executive branch to comply with all federal court rulings. I'm sorry that we have reached a point in our history where we even have to ask the question, but shame on us if we don't. This is not a political resolution. I've tried to make it as apolitical as possible because it gets to these basic principles. I want to thank my colleagues who came forward on the floor to say a word in support of this resolution. And now, Mr. President, as if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of S.Res. 108, affirming the rule of law and the legitimacy of judicial review, which is at the desk. Further, I ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Iowa.
I've always advocated due respect for federal courts, and particularly over the last few years, I've opposed a vicious smear campaign by Democrats designed to undermine faith in our Supreme Court and our judicial system. Now that we have a Republican president, my Democrat colleagues appear to have newfound respect for the courts. It wasn't very long ago that they were singing a different time and a different tune. In the last few years, Democrats have called the Supreme Court, quote, controlled by creepy right-wing billionaires, a radical Supreme Court, and a partisan and reactionary court, end of quote. One of my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee said, quote, the idea that you can trust a Supreme Court has been blown to smithereens, end of quote. Another committee colleague declared, quote, I oppose these justices, end of quote. And yet another committee colleague questioned, quote, how can they call it an honorable court? The far-right justices are cherry-picking their way through constitutional text and history to impose their own ideological agenda on the American people, end of quote. Over the last few years, Democrats have repeatedly threatened the court for ruling in ways that they did not like. Famously, in 2020, the Senate Democratic leaders threatened the court to influence its rulings on abortion. He said, quote, "I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwinds, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions," end quote. And in the wake of the 2024 presidential immunity decision, Democratic House minority leaders said, quote, "House Democrats will engage in aggressive oversight and legislative activity with respect to the Supreme Court to ensure that the extreme far-right justices in the majority are brought into compliance with the Constitution," end of quote. Now, I'm happy that Democrats have finally discovered the importance of respecting the judiciary. They certainly didn't hold this view when President Biden was in office. President Biden ignored the court's position that the CDC's eviction moratorium was unconstitutional, and his own lawyer's advice that he couldn't do it. He went ahead and extended the moratorium anyway, and the court had to strike it down. President Biden boasted once that the court's decision on student loan forgiveness, quote, "didn't stop him," end quote. The Biden administration undermined the court's 2023 decision that racial discrimination in college admissions is unconstitutional, and even issued a Dear Colleague letter on how to circumvent that ruling. More broadly, President Biden flouted law after law throughout his entire administration. He ignored the plain text of our immigration laws, the parole statute, our civil rights laws in the name of advancing his agenda. And you know what? I heard no complaint from my Democrat colleagues. Although I fully agree that Congress stands for the rule of law, this resolution is nothing but a partisan messaging statement. President Trump has been clear on this. Just a few weeks ago, he said, quote, "I'll always abide by the courts, and then I'll have to appeal. The answer is, I always abide by the courts," end of quote. There have been numerous extreme orders from various district courts improperly encroaching on core Article 2 of powers. President Trump and his administration have worked diligently to abide by those orders, no matter how outrageous, by appealing them and challenging their scope and reach. He is completely within his right to do so, and his conduct is appropriate and legitimate. Our constitutional system has a robust system of checks and balances. The executive branch must abide by the courts, and the courts must also ensure that their rulings are respectful of jurisdictional limits, and particularly our famous separation of powers. Some of the recent orders of individual district judges issued on an expedited basis with very broad nationwide impact have concerned me. I think Congress needs to examine this issue closely. Concerns about nationwide injunctions, temporary restraining orders have been raised on both sides of the aisle across presidential administrations. And if my colleagues want to work with me on it, we will head down that route of addressing those abuses. For today's purposes, however, this resolution is incomplete. And coming from Democrats, I think it shows that they're totally inconsistent. It unfairly targets President Trump. In turn, then, it ignores the Democratic attacks on the legitimacy of the court, and it ignores President Biden's flagrant violation of law. So, I am offering Senator Durbin an opportunity that he can't turn down, a resolution to highlight the inappropriate attacks by Democrats against the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, and to clarify the executive branch must comply with lawful orders. So the point is that I ask that the senator would modify his request that the Grassley amendment to the resolutions at the desk be considered and agreed to, and the Grassley amendment to the preamble at the desk be considered and agreed to.
Is there an objection to the modification?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I'd like to ask a question of my friend, the chairman, when it comes to the modification which he is suggesting. Does this include in one request both modifications that we have been given?
Yes, it does.
And so I want to make certain, particularly, that I understand the modification to the resolution clause. And if I understand it correctly, you are adding a word. Perhaps you can clarify that as to whether or not there is a requirement of the executive branch to comply with all federal court rulings. Do you modify that particular sentence?
Yeah, that's right.
And do you add the word lawful?
Yes.
So, Mr. President, I think I want to clarify, so that for the record and for history, there's no dispute. There are differences of opinion about court orders in the past. I would say, without fear of contradiction, that though President Biden's name has been mentioned repeatedly, particularly when it comes to the forgiveness of student loan debt, there was never any acknowledgement of defiance of any court order, period. There was a court order against the Biden administration, and President Biden did not agree with it, but went forward with a different approach to the law. He was never found in contempt, nor any suggestion made that he violated a court order. His name's been mentioned many times, but that just doesn't square with the reality. Here's the difficulty. Think about this for a second. Under Marbury versus Madison, we basically said it is the province and duty of the Judicial Department, judges and courts, to say what the law is. And then the modification being made by the senator from Iowa says you only have to abide by lawful court rulings. Did I state that correctly?
I think we need to clarify, because I think your inference is that Trump has violated some Trump orders. He has not. In fact, this very day, the Supreme Court ruled against him on a 5-4 decision that goes back to the lower court to make a firm decision. And so you can't say that the court system isn't working against President Trump as it worked against President Biden.
That's a fair criticism. I want to make it clear. I'm not saying that President Trump has violated a court order. I don't know that he has. The question is, whenever an order is issued either for him or against him, will he obey the order? Will he acknowledge that that is his lawful responsibility? That's what it comes down to. I'm not looking prospectively or in history, his brief time in the presidency this round, but rather saying that whatever the court order in the future, whether for him or against him, he's bound by that court order. And you have added the word lawful court order. I'm not sure if the court is to decide the law and they decide in his favor, then the law is acknowledged to be binding on him and his actions. Conversely, if the ruling is against him and the court order is against him, I hope you would acknowledge that that is lawful and that he has to follow it even though it ruled against him. That is simple constitutional law. I'm not presuming how the court will rule, but I'm saying however it rules, he is bound by that ruling. Do you agree with me, Senator?
I have made very clear that we have a separation of powers, and each branch has to respect the other's powers.
Well, I acknowledge that as well. The question is, does that mean that the executive branch is bound by the decision of the court and has to follow a court order, whether it is for or against the administration?
I think what I'd like to do is, do you agree with my amendment or you don't, so we can move on and get to other important stuff today? I want to help you get your resolution through, and I wanted just to say what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
That is basic Midwestern philosophy, which we share, and I don't disagree with you. But I think the addition of the word lawful in the final sentence equivocates on what the Constitution's clarity is. So I'm going to object with the possibility that we can work on this together to see if there is a way to reach a conclusion. I think this is so basic. You have served honorably in the United States Senate for an entire career. And the point that I'm getting to is we ought to make certain that moving forward there is clarity on this most basic checks and balances constitutional provision.
Is there an objection to the modification?
I object to the modification as written.
Is there an objection to the original request?
Reserving the right to object before I do object, I want Senator Durbin to know that if there's things like this that we ought to work out, but we can't be complaining about the courts if we got a Democrat president and not complaining, just complaining when we have a Republican president. And I think there's enough abuses of these nationwide orders to stop certain activity that our committee ought to be looking at and reviewing and see if they aren't being abused. I object.
It's heard.